My name is Gloria Whitman, and I am 68 years old. I retired from teaching 5 years ago, leaving behind decades of lesson plans, parent conferences, and the hum of a crowded classroom. I have always taken pride in my independence, in the small life I carved for myself, after years of working hard and managing a household that never seemed to appreciate my efforts. Today, however, I felt that independence shatter in a single instant. I was sitting in my sunlit kitchen in Lincoln, Nebraska, the late afternoon light stretching across the worn oak table, enjoying a cup of chamomile tea and the quiet that comes after a day spent volunteering at the community center. My phone buzzed on the counter and I instinctively reached for it, expecting the usual reminders or a message from a friend. Instead, my eyes fell on a text that made my chest tighten. "Mom, I need $800 for prom. Send it now." I blinked. Once, twice. The words didn't compute at first. $2,800. For a dress. For one night. For a dance. My hand shook slightly as I held the phone, disbelief warring with irritation. I had raised her to be responsible to work for what she wanted. But this demand came wrapped in entitlement, as though I owed her everything simply for being her mother. I stared at the screen, rereading the message, and a cold wave of tension ran through me. My mind flashed back to all the years I had managed household budgets, saved for college tuition, and balanced bills while keeping a calm smile for everyone else. I had never imagined that at my age, my own child could place such a blunt, impossible demand in front of me like a hammer to my chest. A rush of emotions swirled: shock, disbelief, anger, and an almost physical ache of betrayal. How had it come to this after all the work I had done, the sacrifices I had made? For a moment, I just sat there, fingers hovering over the phone, unsure whether to respond, to refuse, to yell, to cry. Then I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, and typed my reply, "Earn it yourself." As soon as I hit send, a quiet dread settled over me. I knew this would not be the end, not by a long shot. Somewhere in the shadows of my mind, I sensed that this single message was the spark of a fire that would engulf more than just my calm afternoon. I set the phone down, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside doing nothing to soothe the sudden storm inside me. I didn't yet know how far this storm would go, or what it would uncover about my family. But I knew one thing: nothing would ever feel the same again. I didn't expect the reply to take long. It came almost instantly, a flurry of words that seemed to spill from the screen, like hot lava. "You're so selfish, Mom. It's just prom. Why can't you help me?" My daughter's anger practically vibrated through the phone. I could hear the sharp edge in her words, the indignation that came not from frustration with the world, but from the conviction that I owed her everything. I set the phone down for a moment, letting the initial sting fade. My fingers hovered over the tea mug, my knuckles tight around the ceramic. I had raised her to know the value of work, to understand that nothing in life worth having comes without effort. Yet here she was, expecting me to fund an extravagant dress, a limousine, and the theater of teenage social perfection, without so much as a thought of earning it herself. Taking a slow breath, I reminded myself why I had typed those words in the first place: "Earn it yourself." The message felt heavier now that she had read it heavier, because it would provoke the inevitable storm. But I also knew it was necessary. At 68, I wasn't about to let my life and savings be dictated by entitlement. I had given so much to raise her, to guide her, and I would not let that be taken for granted. Within moments, another message appeared. This one carried an even sharper tone. "You don't get it. I deserve this. Everyone else will pay for me, so why can't you?" She was demanding not only money, but obedience, and beneath the fury I felt a pinch of disbelief. I had faced challenges in life that would have humbled most people her age, yet here I was, being lectured like a child. I sat in my kitchen, the afternoon sunlight spilling across the counter, and felt a surge of resolve. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the phone again, wanting to respond, to explain, to defend myself, but I knew there was nothing to explain. The lesson had to come from experience. She would learn sooner or later that entitlement had limits. My own life had taught me that lessons sometimes had to be harsh before they were understood. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. I debated letting it ring, but my curiosity and the need to witness the storm firsthand compelled me to answer. "Mom, how can you be like this?" Her voice cracked with fury and panic. "It's prom. All my friends' parents are paying." I pressed my lips together, forcing my voice into calm neutrality. "You're 18, I said evenly. "You are capable of earning what you need. I will not pay for something you can work for yourself." She snorted, the sound filled with disbelief and venom. "You're ruining everything. I can't believe you." "I'm not ruining you," I said quietly. "I'm letting you take responsibility. You'll thank me one day." There was a long silence filled only by the sound of her breathing on the other end. I could almost feel her storm of emotion trying to claw at me, to pull me into guilt, into submission. I braced myself, letting the tension settle like a heavy weight in the room. I had drawn the line. I had stated my boundary clearly. I hung up before she could respond again. The silence returned to the kitchen, but it felt different now, charged, expectant, almost electric. I knew this would not end here. There would be messages, calls, perhaps even ultimatums from others. But I also knew one unshakable truth. I was no longer bending to demands that violated my sense of self and the independence I had fought for all these years. I sat back, gripping the edge of the table, and allowed myself a small, bitter smile. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny flicker of control amidst the chaos that my daughter's demands had brought into my quiet afternoon. I barely had time to catch my breath from the last call when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my daughter. It was my sister sending a string of sharp, impatient texts. "Mom, seriously. Pay up or forget being part of this family. You know how Mom and Dad feel. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." My stomach knotted, and I felt a familiar tension rise in my chest. Even at 68, the old patterns remained. My family had always had a way of turning loyalty into leverage, of binding me with invisible threads of guilt. I hadn't realized how heavy those threads had been until this very moment. As I read the messages, memories surfaced. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager, calculating how many hours I had to work at the diner just to cover my own school supplies, while my sister had a closet full of the newest fashion. My mother would glance at me over her shoulder and say, "She's young. Let her enjoy life." And my father, ever quiet, would nod. I learned early that my needs were negotiable, my feelings secondary. The lesson had always been clear: sacrifice yourself for the family, even when it didn't make sense. Now, decades later, those lessons came rushing back. I felt the old guilt creeping in, the subtle pressure to conform, to give, until there was nothing left. But this time, the stakes were different. I wasn't a teenager scrambling for approval. I wasn't someone whose life depended on parental validation. I was Gloria Whitman, 68, with a life I had built on my own terms. And yet, here they were, reaching across time and distance to pull me back into the same patterns. Another text arrived, this one from my mother, Gloria. "This isn't just about a dress. Family sticks together. You can't abandon us now." I could almost hear the tremor in her words, the way she always mixed love with threat. I remembered the endless years of caretaking, of being the responsible one, the one who fixed problems quietly, while others enjoyed the benefits. That sense of obligation had been woven into me so tightly that even now it pulsed at the edges of my awareness. I set the phone down, leaning back in my chair, My hands shook slightly, not with fear, but with the intensity of decades of suppressed frustration finally rising to the surface. I realized something then. Loyalty to family did not mean surrendering my autonomy. It did not mean allowing myself to be used, manipulated, or diminished. And yet the line between duty and exploitation had always been blurry. I remembered the family dinners, the whispered judgments, the quiet exchanges that made it clear who was favored and who was expendable. I had endured it all thinking endurance equaled love. Now the text messages reminded me that love should never come at the cost of erasing oneself. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, feeling the weight of the past settle into clarity. I could hear the distant chirp of birds outside the hum of the refrigerator, and I knew one thing: the family storm was here, and it would not pass quietly. But for the first time, I felt ready to stand in the center of it, unshaken, and refuse to be swept away. I sank into the kitchen chair, letting the weight of the afternoon press against me, and suddenly the past rose like a tide I hadn't expected. It was impossible not to remember, impossible not to see it all. The long years of raising children, of giving, until I felt empty, while the world seemed to bend effortlessly around my daughter. I remembered the first day she came home from school, clutching a library book with smudged pages, proudly showing me her grades. I smiled, nodded, and set down the ironing I had been doing for the 5th time that morning, telling her how proud I was. She had been careful, eager to please, and innocent in the way only children can be. But even then, I noticed how the smallest accomplishment earned her praise, while my own efforts often went unremarked, assumed invisible. When she was born, I was already 51. I had spent decades working, saving, juggling bills and responsibilities, raising her older sibling to understand discipline, diligence, and patience. Yet somehow, the rules shifted with her. My husband at the time, though, mostly absent after his retirement, was indulgent, his eyes softening for her in ways that reminded me sharply of what it had been like for me to be overlooked. My mother-in-law would visit, and I would hear her coo over the baby, praising her tiny fingers, tiny toes, her every breath, while my own achievements were reduced to nods or passing remarks. I remembered the birthday parties, elaborate affairs that left me exhausted but praised the wrong hands. A princess-themed extravaganza for her 10th birthday, costing far more than I could have imagined, $2,000 on decorations, costumes, gifts, while I balanced nights of grading papers and working extra shifts to keep our household afloat. I smiled for the cameras posed for photographs and carried her swaddled in silk and sequins across the floor, all the while feeling the invisible scales tipping against me. Even during ordinary days, the contrast was glaring. While I worked long hours at the school teaching children lessons I hoped would matter, my daughter roamed freely, her whims indulged, her needs met before she could articulate them. I fixed meals, packed lunches, ran errands, juggled doctor's appointments, all while watching her enjoy privileges that had been years in the making. For her sibling privileges she seemed to take for granted. The memories stung, the bitterness settling into my chest. I remembered nights lying awake calculating how I had managed bills, tuition, and groceries, often wondering if my efforts had been seen, appreciated, or even noticed at all. And yet every time I voiced a concern, I was reminded of my place, gently but firmly, nudged back into obedience, into the role of caretaker, financier, and silent laborer. My daughter, always bright and charming, never had to lift a finger. She learned early that the world responded differently to her, that her desires came first, and that the boundaries others set for themselves didn't apply to her. I resented it, yes, but I also grieved quietly for the version of myself that had been trained to bend, to accommodate, to sacrifice, until my own needs were nearly invisible. Now, decades later, sitting in the quiet of my Lincoln kitchen, I could see the pattern with startling clarity. The lessons I had absorbed, the sacrifices I had made, had shaped me into a person who would always put others first, until now. And in that moment, with my daughter demanding what I could no longer and should no longer give, I felt a surge of resolve. I would not repeat the mistakes of the past. I would not allow history to define my present. I closed my eyes, remembering the countless times I had stood at the intersection of duty and desire, choosing duty every time. I felt the grief of decades, the resentment that had quietly shaped me, and the frustration that lingered stubborn and sharp. But beneath it all, a quiet, steady thread of determination emerged. I had lived my life for others for long enough. It was time to honor myself, to set boundaries that had been long overdue, and to finally live in the space I had carved with my own hands. I glanced out the kitchen window, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the Lincoln neighborhood. The streets were quiet now, a few children on bicycles, and neighbors strolling with their dogs. For the first time in decades, the rhythm of life felt entirely my own. I had worked long and hard, and retirement had finally given me the freedom to breathe, to exist on my own terms, without constantly calculating for someone else's needs or whims. Since retiring, I had thrown myself into community projects I cared about. Twice a week, I volunteered at the local library, helping teens navigate their first experiences with literature, learning to write essays, or simply providing a listening ear when the world felt overwhelming. It reminded me of why I had chosen teaching in the first place, the joy of watching someone grow, of knowing you've made a difference. Unlike those years of personal sacrifice for my family, this work was purely for love, and the reward was immeasurable. My garden, too, had become a sanctuary. The small patch of land behind my home bloomed with lavender marigolds and a few stubborn tomato plants that somehow thrived despite my sometimes forgetful nature. I would spend mornings tending to the soil, pruning, watering, and listening to the quiet hum of bees. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I craved until I had it. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of accomplishment entirely my own. Each petal and leaf was a reminder that I could nurture and care for something without being drained, without being used as a crutch. Evenings were for hobbies I had long neglected. I dusted off old paints and brushes, sketching landscapes of the Nebraska plains as they appeared from memory and imagination. Sometimes I would sit at the piano, a relic from decades past, coaxing long-forgotten melodies from ivory keys. These small joys weren't grand or expensive, but they were mine. They reminded me that independence was not just a word, it was a state of being cultivated over years of self-reliance and hard-earned patience. I had friends I saw regularly, people who shared my interests and understood my life without judgment. We would meet for coffee, debate books, plan small excursions to the city's art museums, or simply sit quietly in the sun at the park. Conversation felt easy. Laughter wasn't laced with obligation or guilt. It was a space where I could be Gloria, not the perpetual caretaker or financial backstop. And yet, even amidst this life, I had built a lingering awareness remained. The recent texts from my daughter and the intrusive messages from family reminded me that freedom could be fragile, easily disrupted by those who still believed I owed them pieces of myself. I felt that tension in the pit of my stomach as I sipped tea, the quiet of the room contrasting sharply with the storm I sensed brewing beyond these walls. I set the cup down, looking around my small but comfortable kitchen, and allowed a deep sigh to escape. For decades, I had put everyone else's life ahead of my own. Every choice, every sacrifice had been for someone else. Now I had a life of my own, and I realized that enjoying it fully required courage, the courage to resist guilt, to refuse manipulation, to honor boundaries I had ignored for too long. I rose and opened the window wider, letting the evening air in. The world outside was calm, but I knew my own storm was just beginning. Living for myself would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it fully, to live each moment on my terms, and to claim the independence I had worked a lifetime to earn. I leaned back in my chair, letting my fingers trace the edge of the table, as the afternoon sunlight pooled across the kitchen floor. My eyes drifted to the small stack of bills I had set aside earlier. It reminded me once again of the decisions I had made over the years to keep my family afloat. One of the most significant, and in hindsight the most consequential, had been the joint family account I had set up when my daughter turned 15. It had seemed like a practical solution at the time. My daughter was in high school. My responsibilities to the household had multiplied, and I wanted to make life easier for everyone. The idea was simple: a central account to cover essentials, utilities, groceries, occasional emergencies. I thought it would relieve stress, prevent arguments over money, and teach my daughter responsibility without letting her feel the weight of adult worries too early. I had even included her father on it, though he was mostly absent, more a name than a presence. I remember setting it up at the bank, the banker congratulating me on being so thoughtful, and I had smiled, nodding politely, unaware of the weight of what I was signing. It was meant to be a tool of support, not a lever for entitlement. I trusted that everyone would use it responsibly, assuming my family would behave with the same care and honesty I had always tried to uphold. But trust is a fragile thing, and intention is not always matched by action. Looking back now, I see how easy it was for my good intentions to be exploited. Small withdrawals for unexpected expenses slowly added up, each one justified with plausible explanations: a new set of clothes here, a dinner out there. My daughter, bright and charming, as always, never had to ask twice. The account became a silent witness to a pattern I refused to notice at first: the expectation that I would cover every whim, every desire, simply because I could. I had convinced myself that I was helping, that I was providing stability, that I was the responsible one, ensuring nothing fell through the cracks. And for years it worked quietly, almost invisibly, but beneath the surface, a seed of imbalance had taken root. My generosity had become a lifeline for dependency, and my attempts to teach responsibility were being drowned out by the ease with which my daughter, and increasingly my family, reached for my support. Even now, the knowledge of how that account had been used gnawed at me. It was the same account that would, within the week, become the focal point of confrontation, betrayal, and reckoning. What had begun as a tool of care had slowly morphed into a conduit for expectation, manipulation, and entitlement. I felt a pang of regret, not for helping, but for failing to recognize the signs sooner, for letting trust be mistaken for obligation. I folded my hands on the table and closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the afternoon seep into my bones. Every decision I had made with that account had been rooted in love and practicality, yet love alone had not been enough to prevent misuse. The boundary I had hoped to establish between support and exploitation had blurred, and now the consequences were beginning to ripple through my life in ways I could no longer ignore. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A $150 charge at a boutique I didn't recognize, a $200 withdrawal labeled vaguely as miscellaneous, small enough that I shrugged it off and assumed it was necessary. I told myself I was being overly cautious, that perhaps my daughter had found a way to manage some of her own spending, or that my parents had needed extra cash for bills. But over the weeks, the pattern became harder to ignore. I began to notice the receipts piling up in my mental ledger. New outfits for my daughter, designer labels I couldn't have afforded when I was her age. Extravagant dinners at restaurants I had never visited. Weekend excursions that seemed luxurious for a high school student. And the explanations always sounded reasonable. Unexpected school project expenses. A treat for finishing finals. Mom, It was on sale. Each time I nodded, tried to rationalize, and then felt a small prickle of unease, I pushed away. At first, I blamed myself. Perhaps I hadn't taught her well enough about money. Perhaps I had spoiled her unintentionally, letting convenience and my own desire to be helpful cloud judgment. But the gnawing sense that something wasn't right persisted, growing sharper each time I checked the bank statements. My hands would tighten around the cup of tea I kept by my side, heart thudding in a rhythm that I couldn't quite calm. I started cross-referencing the charges with dates and explanations. The inconsistencies stood out like glaring red flags. Every Friday, another boutique purchase, every other weekend, a charge at a fancy cafe or a local spa. And always a justification ready spoken or unspoken, meant to ease my conscience. I felt anger bubbling up not at my daughter, but at the quiet complicity of the system I had created. The account was supposed to be a tool of care, but now it felt like a pipeline for indulgence I had unwittingly sanctioned. Guilt intertwined with the anger. I had set this account up with the best intentions, believing that I was helping, that I was providing stability and support. How could I have imagined that the very system I trusted would be exploited? The same hands I had raised, the same family I had nurtured, were now using my generosity as a shortcut, a means to avoid responsibility. I confronted myself in the quiet of the kitchen, sitting at the table, eyes fixed on the faded wood grain. How long had this been going on? How many small withdrawals had I ignored because I wanted to trust? Because I wanted to believe that my family would act with integrity. The more I thought, the more my stomach twisted with frustration. Years of careful planning and sacrifice had been quietly diverted, eroding the boundaries I had tried to set. And yet, beneath the swelling anger, there was a deeper fear. What if my confrontation caused resentment, or a rift that couldn't be repaired? What if my daughter felt justified? What if my parents were defensive? These questions circled in my mind, each one heavier than the last, layering tension onto the unease I already carried. I closed the ledger app on my phone and leaned back, letting out a long, quiet sigh. The unease had grown into clarity. Something had to change. My trust had been tested, my patience stretched thin, and the small signs of exploitation I had once dismissed could no longer be ignored. The account I had established to provide stability was now a lens revealing a pattern I needed to confront before it grew any further. The phone rang sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet of my Lincoln kitchen. I recognized the number immediately, and my chest tightened before I even answered. It was her. My daughter. My daughter with the sharp tongue and the piercing expectation that I had spent the last 18 years trying to balance. "Mom," she barked as soon as I picked up, her voice tight with fury. "I can't believe you. How can you say no? I need the money for prom. Everyone else's parents are paying." I pressed my lips together, willing my voice to remain steady. "I know you want it," I said carefully. "But you're capable of earning it yourself. You don't need me to cover every expense." Her laugh, high-pitched, incredulous, dripping with scorn, made my stomach twist. "You're so selfish. It's just prom. You don't understand what it means." "I do understand," I replied evenly, though the silence that followed gave me a moment to collect myself. "It's an event one night, but it doesn't give you the right to my money. You're 18. You can work, save, and pay for what you want." She scoffed, a sound that felt like nails on a chalkboard. "You don't get it. You don't care about me. You're ruining everything." I took a slow breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders tighten, then consciously loosen. I had spent a lifetime responding to demands with compliance to guilt, with acquiescence, but not this time. My independence, my boundaries were not negotiable, no matter how much she screamed or pleaded. "You're not ruined," I said quietly, "and I'm not the one ruining anything. I'm letting you face reality. I've given you enough to learn responsibility. This is part of that lesson." Her voice trembled now, a mixture of fury and panic. "You can't do this. I deserve it. Everyone else gets it. Why can't you? I'm not here to grant entitlement. I said, my voice firm steady. You'll learn more from earning it than I could ever teach you by giving it. The line went silent for a moment, and I could hear her sharp breaths, the quick intake of frustration that spoke volumes. Then she spoke again, lower this time, her words almost pleading. You don't care about me at all, do you? I care about you enough to tell you the truth, I said, and to protect myself in the process. There is a difference between love and enabling. I won't blur that line. Her tone shifted suddenly, shrill and accusatory. You're so unfair, I can't believe this. I understand you're upset, I said calmly. And that's okay. Anger doesn't give anyone the right to demand what isn't theirs. I won't change my mind, and I won't apologize for teaching you what responsibility really means. There was a long pause broken only by the sound of the wind outside and the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, she hung up, leaving a faint crackle in the line and a silence that seemed almost tangible. I sat back, phone in hand, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. The confrontation had been necessary, but it had also confirmed everything I had feared. The patterns of expectation, entitlement, and manipulation were deeply ingrained. My daughter had tested the limits of what I would endure, and I had held firm. The afternoon light slanted across the kitchen, casting long shadows over the counter, and I realized the storm had only just begun. My boundary had been drawn, but now it would be tested, challenged, and examined by the family in ways I could not yet anticipate. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of both control and responsibility settle squarely on my shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a haze of buzzing notifications and rising tension. My phone vibrated constantly, each message sharper than the last. My daughter wasn't the only one messaging anymore. My sister had joined the chorus, sending short, cutting reminders. Mom, you need to pay. Stop being difficult. Then my mother chimed in with a flurry of texts that felt almost rehearsed. Gloria, this is about family. You can't turn your back now. We're counting on you. Don't make us regret trusting you. I set the phone down, letting out a slow, measured breath, but the tightness in my chest didn't ease. It had been decades since my family had used guilt as a weapon, yet here it was pressing down on me as if I were 17 again, still trying to navigate rules I had long outgrown. Every line of text carried the same weight, obedience, or punishment. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. Pay up or be cast aside. A wave of frustration, mingled with exhaustion, swept over me. I had spent years trying to keep the family afloat, often at the expense of my own peace and priorities. Bills, groceries, school fees, repairs. I had handled it all quietly, without complaint. I had been the responsible one, the invisible backbone of our household. And yet now I was being told that my sacrifices meant nothing if I refused a single extravagant demand. I caught a glimpse of myself in the window, the fading light reflecting my lined face and silver hair. My eyes felt heavy with fatigue. But beneath that weariness, a spark of determination glimmered. I had faced difficult choices before. I had navigated crises that would have unraveled others. And I had learned painfully that surrendering to manipulation only left me weaker, diminished, and resentful. Another message appeared. This time it was from my father, brief and cold. Do the right thing, Gloria. You've been entrusted with this responsibility for a reason. Don't let your pride ruin the family. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling both the sting of accusation and the undeniable truth in his words. The account I had set up had been a gesture of love, yes, but it had also become the mechanism by which they believed they could control me. I closed my eyes, allowing myself a mental rewind to earlier years. I remembered nights spent balancing checks trying to stretch every dollar, and afternoons tutoring my daughter's sibling while the other played with the latest toy I couldn't afford. I remembered the quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing, even when it went unnoticed. And I remembered the first time I had felt that gnawing injustice when my own contributions were overlooked in favor of indulgence and preferential treatment. A sharp ping brought me back to the present. Another message, this one from my sister. "You're so selfish, Mom. If you loved us, you'd just pay. Don't make this about you." My pulse quickened. Anger rose, but I fought it down, keeping my tone calm when I finally typed back, "Love isn't measured by money. I will not fund entitlement." The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of their expectations. I felt trapped, hemmed in by decades of obligation and the sudden relentless pressure of the day. My fingers trembled slightly as I set the phone aside, but even as anxiety coiled tight in my chest, I knew one thing: I would not give in. My life, my independence, and the principles I had fought to uphold were more important than appeasing entitlement. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, bathed in late sunlight. The world beyond seemed oblivious to my storm, and for a moment, that gave me a strange sense of clarity. I could not control their expectations, nor could I let them dictate my choices. I would face this pressure, endure it, and make my decisions with deliberate care. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but the quiet only amplified the storm raging inside me. I sat at the table with my laptop open, the screen glowing in the late afternoon light. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant heart hammering. I had been postponing this moment for weeks, afraid of what I might find, yet unable to ignore the gnawing suspicion that had settled in my chest. It was time. I logged into the family account, the one I had set up years ago, with nothing but good intentions. My eyes scanned the recent transactions first, the numbers swimming before me, each line demanding attention. At first glance, nothing seemed glaringly out of place. Routine payments for utilities, occasional grocery charges. But as I scrolled back further, a pattern began to emerge. There was a withdrawal here for $1,200, labeled vaguely as miscellaneous expenses. Another $850 a few weeks later, again tagged with an ambiguous note. Then a series of charges at boutique clothing stores, coffee shops, and even a spa I had never heard of. The numbers were small enough individually to dismiss, but collectively they hinted at something larger, something deliberate. I felt my stomach twist. My daughter's prom demand had been the spark, but these withdrawals told a deeper story, one I had been avoiding. I clicked through month after month, tracing every debit, comparing dates and amounts to my memory of discussions with the family. The unease I had felt in the back of my mind was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. There it was, a series of large withdrawals, $5,000 over the past 2 months, alone with no explanation, no warning, no request. My pulse raced. My hands trembled slightly, gripping the edges of the table. I had been trying to trust them, believing that the account was used responsibly, that my contributions were going toward genuine needs. And now all at once I realized how misplaced that trust had been. The anger rose, first sharp and burning, twisting through me like fire. How could they do this? How could they take something I had worked so hard to provide, something I had intended as support, and turn it into a conduit for entitlement and indulgence? I felt betrayed, not only by my daughter, but by the entire family system I had upheld for decades. The accounts I had overseen, the money I had provided quietly and faithfully, had been siphoned away without a thought for my autonomy or consent. Then came the disillusionment, a slow, sinking ache beneath the anger. I remembered the countless times I had put their needs before my own, the years of sacrifice, the careful budgeting, the countless hours of silent labor, and now it felt as though all of it had been taken for granted. used as a foundation for greed and expectation, rather than love or mutual respect. I sat back, staring at the screen, trying to breathe, trying to reconcile the woman I had been with the reality of what had been done. Every familiar charge, every line item became a symbol of manipulation of the subtle ways in which my generosity had been turned against me. The sense of violation was almost physical, a weight pressing down on my chest. Yet beneath the fury and hurt, clarity began to emerge. The account was more than just money. It was proof of a pattern, a tangible record of exploitation and entitlement that had been allowed to grow unchecked. I realized I could no longer ignore it, could no longer hope it would correct itself. To preserve my integrity and reclaim my autonomy, I would have to confront the truth head on. I closed the laptop for a moment, placing my hands over my eyes. The silence in the kitchen felt suffocating, but it also offered a strange sense of focus. I could feel the shift inside me, the anger, the disappointment, the sense of betrayal all coalescing into something resolute. I knew that the next step would require courage, careful planning, and perhaps the assistance of someone who could help me navigate the legal and emotional terrain I was stepping into. I reopened the laptop and began taking notes, writing down every suspicious transaction, every date, every withdrawal. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were a map, a story of deception and misplaced trust. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth I had avoided for far too long. I could not fix this by myself, but I could control how I responded, how I protected myself, and how I set boundaries that could never again be ignored. I sat at my kitchen table long after the sunlight had faded into the muted gray of early evening, the laptop open in front of me. The list of suspicious transactions stretched back months, a tangled web of withdrawals, purchases, and unexplained expenses that left me both furious and exhausted. I knew deep down that I could not unravel this on my own. There were limits to what I could discern from account statements and vague explanations, no matter how meticulous I was. I needed someone who understood the law, someone I could trust implicitly. Ellen Ward came to mind immediately. She had been a friend for nearly 20 years, a sharp, methodical lawyer with a calm presence that could cut through the noise of any crisis. Over the years, we had shared coffee and conversation about everything from books to life choices, and I had always trusted her judgment. Now, more than ever, I needed that judgment applied to something far more personal and unsettling. I took a deep breath and dialed her number, my fingers trembling slightly as I held the phone. When Ellen answered, her voice was warm and familiar. "Gloria, it's been a while. How are you?" "I'm okay," I said slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I need your help. It's urgent." There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel the weight of my next words. "I think someone has been misusing the family account I set up. There are withdrawals charges I don't understand, and I need to know exactly what's going on." Ellen's tone shifted slightly, attentive and professional. "All right. Let's meet at my office this evening. Bring everything you have. Statements, notes, any correspondence. We'll go through it together." By 6:30, I was sitting across from Ellen in her office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the stacks of files and folders forming organized towers around her desk. Her sharp eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. "Show me everything," she said simply. "We'll start from the beginning." I laid out the laptop, printed statements, and my notes, walking her through the series of charges I had tracked, the dates, the amounts, the questionable vendors, and the inconsistent explanations. Ellen nodded, taking notes, her eyes scanning quickly, calculating, analyzing. "I see what you mean," she said finally, leaning back in her chair. "Some of these withdrawals are substantial, and some appear to have no explanation at all. We'll need to request the full transaction history from the bank and cross-reference everything. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mix of dread and relief. Dread for what we might uncover, relief that someone capable was finally guiding me through this mess. "Do you know who had access to this account?" Ellen asked, her tone neutral but precise. "Yes," I replied. "My daughter, my parents, and the account is still under my name. But I haven't monitored it closely for months, and I didn't anticipate misuse on this scale." Ellen nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "It happens more often than people realize," she said softly. "People set up accounts with good intentions, and others exploit them. But don't worry, we'll get to the bottom of it. First, we need the bank records for the entire period, all withdrawals, all deposits, every note attached." I felt a shiver run through me, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. For years, I had believed that my generosity and trust would protect my family, that my efforts were appreciated. Now it was clear that trust alone had left me vulnerable. Ellen opened her laptop and began drafting emails and forms to request the records. "We'll also want to flag these transactions," she said. "Anything that looks inconsistent or unexplained will be scrutinized. If necessary, we can subpoena documents. You'll need a detailed map of every movement of money to understand what's happening." As she worked, I sat back in the chair, hands folded tightly in my lap. My mind raced, replaying moments, transactions, messages, calls. The reality of betrayal was settling over me like a heavy fog. But for the first time in days, I felt a small sense of control. I wasn't helpless. I had enlisted someone skilled, someone methodical, someone who could see through the layers of deception. By the time we finished for the evening, Ellen had a preliminary plan request, detailed records, identify all irregularities, and prepare for confrontation if the numbers confirmed my suspicions. I packed up my papers, feeling the weight of anticipation pressing against me. The investigation was underway, and while the uncertainty was unnerving, I also felt a flicker of hope. Knowledge would be my weapon. Truth would be my shield. The office was quiet, the muted hum of the air conditioner and the soft tapping of Ellen's keyboard filling the space as we sifted through the transaction records. My fingers were tightly folded in my lap, knuckles white, as I watched her navigate the pages with precision. Each line she highlighted seemed to etch itself into my memory, the dates, the amounts, the vendors, the small accumulating betrayals that had been quietly building for years. "Gloria," Ellen said finally, her voice steady but soft. "You need to see this." She swiveled the laptop toward me and pointed at the first large withdrawal. $3,500. A few lines down, $2, $200. Another for $100. All from the joint family account. I leaned closer, my chest tightening. The numbers were staggering. Not just amounts, but the frequency, the regularity, the audacity of it all. "They've been siphoning money for years," Ellen continued, scrolling through more statements. "Not just for bills or necessities. Some of this went to paying off debts, credit cards, a second mortgage you weren't aware of, and some for luxury items. And look at this." She circled a transaction with a neat precision. $2,800 paid to an event planner. My stomach lurched. I didn't need to be told. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The prom demand, the boutique charges, the lavish dinners, the weekend trips, all of it had been funded by my own contributions. Every emergency or unexpected expense had been carefully packaged, hidden in plain sight while I had assumed I was helping. Instead, I had been quietly bankrolling a lifestyle that was never mine to sustain. I felt a wave of emotions hit at once: disbelief, anger, and the cold, hollow ache of betrayal. Years of trust, years of diligent sacrifice had been used as a foundation for entitlement and deception. I had believed that my generosity would be respected, that my intentions would be honored. And yet, here it was, laid bare, raw, and undeniable. Ellen paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Gloria, she said it looks like the total siphoned over 4 years comes to roughly $100,000. $100,000. The number floated in the air, impossible and infuriating. I gritted my teeth, feeling a mix of fury and grief, the years of unnoticed labor and careful budgeting collapsing into a single sharp moment of clarity. The realization stung deeper than any individual withdrawal. It was the betrayal itself, the calculated exploitation of my trust, that cut the deepest. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had survived challenges before, faced storms that left others broken, and I was not about to crumble now. Instead, I felt a surge of resolve. Knowledge had given me power, the power to confront this pattern, to demand accountability, to finally reclaim control. Ellen leaned back, her expression solemn but resolute. We can document this all meticulously. Every withdrawal, every vendor, every date. If you choose to confront them, you'll have proof. You can't be accused of exaggerating or misunderstanding. The evidence is clear. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly. The betrayal was staggering, but now I knew I was not powerless. I could respond, and I would respond carefully, deliberately, and firmly. For the first time in years, the fear of what might come from family pressure was tempered by the certainty that I had the facts and that I would not allow my trust to be violated again. I closed the laptop for a moment, resting my forehead against my folded hands. The emotional weight was almost unbearable, yet beneath it lay a growing determination. This revelation, as painful as it was, had clarified the path forward. The long-standing deception could not continue, not if I intended to preserve my life, my independence, and my dignity. And somewhere beneath the anger and shock, a small, steady flame of resolve burned. I would confront them, yes, but I would do so on my terms. The truth was mine now, and with it, the power to finally reclaim what had been taken. I stared at the laptop screen, the glow illuminating the tension etched across my face. 4 years of careful oversight, countless small sacrifices, and the trust I had placed in my family had been violated. The numbers were undeniable, the pattern clear, and the weight of it pressed against my chest like a boulder. I felt a storm of emotions swirling inside me, betrayal, anger, exhaustion. But beneath it all, a thread of resolve had begun to solidify. For months, I had postponed taking action, telling myself I could handle it quietly, that confrontation would be messy, that perhaps understanding would emerge if I stayed patient. But patience had only allowed the exploitation to continue. My generosity had been mistaken for obligation, my trust treated as a resource to be drained. The time for deliberation was over. I had to reclaim control, not for anyone else, but for myself. I opened the bank's website and navigated to the family account, my fingers hovering over the controls. My heart pounded in my ears. Closing it would be irrevocable, a definitive severing of the invisible threads that had bound me to the family's demands. And yet the thought brought a surge of clarity I had not felt in years. Freedom at last was within reach. I paused for a moment, reflecting on the path that had led here. The late nights balancing bills, the countless hours spent trying to keep everyone afloat, the subtle guilt woven into years of devotion. None of it had earned respect or gratitude. Instead, it had created a system where my efforts were taken for granted, where entitlement had flourished at the expense of my autonomy. I could no longer participate in that system without losing myself entirely. A deep breath steadied me. With deliberate precision, I clicked through the steps to close the account. The confirmation screen appeared, asking me if I was certain. I stared at it for a long moment, letting the significance sink in. I was not just closing an account. I was closing a chapter of my life that had been filled with unacknowledged labor, misplaced trust, and quiet resentment. Yes, I whispered to myself, this ends now. The final click echoed like a bell in the silent kitchen. The account was closed. The control I had once surrendered piece by piece was now mine again. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, the two emotions intertwined like threads in a tapestry. There would be consequences, no doubt, messages, calls perhaps, anger or accusations, but for the first time, I felt the weight of obligation lift. I drafted a brief email to my family, keeping it concise, factual, and firm. No explanations, no justifications, only clarity. The account was closed. The discrepancies were documented, and moving forward, I would no longer contribute or tolerate exploitation. My hands trembled slightly as I hit send, but the tremor was less fear than release. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle around me. The tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by a sense of cautious empowerment. I had taken the first definitive step toward reclaiming my life, setting boundaries that had long been ignored, and embracing a freedom that had been denied to me for too long. For the first time in decades, I felt the fragile beginnings of emotional liberation. The path ahead was uncertain, but I no longer felt trapped. The decision had been mine entirely, and with it came the clarity that I would no longer allow others to define the terms of my life. The drive to my parents' suburban home felt longer than it should have, each stoplight, and turn stretching the seconds into something heavier, more deliberate. In the passenger seat beside me sat the folder I had spent hours organizing: bank statements, transaction logs, printed receipts, proof of everything I had uncovered. My hands rested on top of it, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment ahead. I parked in the driveway, the familiar brick house bathed in late afternoon sunlight. Memories of decades past, dinners, holidays, small triumphs and disappointments flickered through my mind, each one tinged with both love and frustration. I carried that weight with me as I climbed the steps and rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door first, her expression polite but guarded. She smiled, the kind of smile meant to placate, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Gloria, come in," she said, stepping aside. My father appeared from the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable. And there, slouched in the living room armchair with her phone in hand, was my daughter, looking anywhere but at me. I stepped inside, keeping my voice steady, though the adrenaline coursing through me made it tight and controlled. "We need to talk," I said, setting the folder down carefully on the coffee table. The paper slid open, revealing months of meticulous records. "I've gone through the family account, and I have everything documented." Their eyes followed the folder, and I could feel the shift in the room, the tension coiling like a spring, ready to snap. I began laying it out systematically: withdrawals, dates, vendors, the pattern that had emerged over 4 years. My father leaned forward slightly, but my mother's hand tightened over her purse strap. My daughter's eyes flicked up finally, wide, startled, and then down again. "This account," I said, my voice firm, "was intended to cover necessary expenses to support emergencies and essential bills. Instead, it has been used to fund debts, luxury purchases, and even your prom, unapproved and undisclosed." I pointed to specific entries, watching their faces change with each number, each line of evidence. My mother's face crumpled, but not in guilt, more in disbelief, as though my revelation had shattered a carefully constructed narrative she had held in her mind. "How could you dig through our private matters?" she said, her voice trembling. "This is family." I met her gaze evenly. "Family does not give anyone the right to misuse trust," I replied. "I have been patient. I have been silent. I have managed this for years, but that silence has been taken for granted. The account is closed, and I will no longer fund this pattern." My father's jaw tightened. "You don't understand. We had no choice. These debts, these expenses, you were supposed to help." "I did help. I said, my voice rising slightly, though still measured. For years, I covered necessities, emergencies, and bills. But covering indulgences and entitlement is not my responsibility. That is not help. It is exploitation. My daughter finally looked up, eyes flashing with a mix of fear and outrage. You're destroying everything. You're tearing the family apart. I felt a cold clarity settle in me. No, I said firmly. You've been living with privileges funded by my trust for too long. I am not tearing anything apart. I am setting boundaries. I am reclaiming my life and my dignity. For a long moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock. Then my mother's voice, softer now, but still sharp with indignation. You're abandoning us. I shook my head slowly, feeling a strange calm descend. I am not abandoning anyone, I said. I am refusing to be complicit in deception. The boundaries I am setting are for my protection. For the first time, I am choosing myself. My father exhaled, and my daughter's expression faltered, the confidence she had wielded so effortlessly now shaken. The storm had been unleashed, and in that quiet aftermath I realized the truth had done its work, not to restore comfort, but to illuminate reality. Every demand, every entitlement, every pattern of exploitation had been laid bare, and I had finally taken my place outside of it, unshaken and resolute. I left the house that evening with a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity settling over me. The confrontation had been everything I had anticipated. Heated, painful, necessary, but even as I drove down the familiar streets of Lincoln, I could feel the ripple effects of my actions spreading behind me, catching my family off guard. By the time I returned home, my phone was already buzzing incessantly. Messages, missed calls, frantic texts, they all bore the unmistakable marks of panic. My mother had sent multiple messages, her words a tangled mixture of indignation, fear, and disbelief. Gloria, how could you do this? We needed that money. You're abandoning us. Think of the consequences. My father's voice came through in a series of terse, urgent texts. This was supposed to be for the family, for the house, for stability. You've ruined everything. We can't function without this. And my daughter. Her calls were relentless, alternating between anger, confusion, and the faint tremor of fear. Mom, you can't do this. I don't know what we're going to do. She sounded smaller than she had in years, stripped of the arrogance and entitlement that had dominated our earlier conversations. I read each message carefully, my fingers tracing the edges of the phone, feeling a mix of pity and resolve. I had expected resistance, of course. I had expected denial, perhaps even anger. But what surprised me most was the raw vulnerability beneath their words, the first real acknowledgement that my boundaries were no longer negotiable. The days that followed revealed the extent of the fallout. My parents, who had always maintained an image of stability, began to face the tangible consequences of their financial mismanagement. Bills went unpaid, credit lines were maxed, and the second mortgage I had only recently discovered loomed over them like a shadow they could no longer ignore. It was sobering to realize that their panic was rooted not in my actions alone, but in the reality they had been avoiding for years. My daughter, meanwhile, began to confront her own understanding of responsibility. Without the safety net of my contributions, she was forced to make choices she had never considered budgeting, prioritizing even seeking part-time work to cover her immediate expenses. The entitlement I had spent so many years countering was now meeting the hard edge of consequence. And me, I felt a curious blend of emotions. There was pain, certainly, the ache of seeing those I loved, struggle, the discomfort of disrupting patterns that had defined our family for decades. But there was also liberation, a quiet, steady relief that came from reclaiming my life, from drawing a line that could not be crossed. I could breathe without the constant weight of obligation pressing down on me. My autonomy, long deferred, was finally mine. I spent that evening walking through my garden, letting the cool air brush against my face, reflecting on the paradox of the situation. I had caused turmoil, yes, but I had also forced clarity. The truth had been revealed, and with it came lessons that could not be ignored. Accountability matters. Boundaries are essential, and even love must respect the autonomy of those who give it. Sitting on the small bench beneath the lilac bush, I let my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. I had faced the storm, and while its echoes would linger, I felt a measure of peace in knowing that I had acted with integrity, that I had preserved myself. The fallout was uncomfortable, unavoidable, and perhaps necessary. In that discomfort, I recognized the emergence of something vital, freedom tempered with wisdom, pain interwoven with liberation. The weeks after the confrontation were quiet, in a way I hadn't anticipated. The house on the suburban street that my parents had once clung to so tightly was now the subject of movers and auction notices. I heard through a distant cousin that the bankruptcy had been finalized. Their carefully maintained image of stability had crumbled under the weight of debts they had long ignored. Part of me ached for them for the life they had built and lost, but another part of me felt a steady, undeniable relief. I had done what I could. The rest was beyond my control. My daughter, once so sure that everything would be handed to her, was beginning to understand responsibility in ways she never had before. She started a part-time job at a local boutique, learning to fold shirts, neatly operate the register, and manage the small but meaningful wages she earned. I observed from a distance, offering guidance only when asked, letting her face the natural consequences of the choices she had taken for granted. It was difficult to watch, and yet it was exactly what she needed. I focused on myself, something I had neglected for decades. I began therapy meeting with Dr. Kessler, a compassionate yet firm therapist who helped me untangle the guilt I had carried for years, the subtle, lingering anxiety that came from always putting everyone else first. The sessions were sometimes exhausting, unearthing emotions I had long ignored: anger, grief, regret. But they were also profoundly freeing. Each conversation helped me rebuild the confidence that my family's manipulation had chipped away. Boundaries became a priority. I stopped answering calls, immediately filtered emails, and clarified expectations with those around me. The freedom to decide when and how to engage with family and friends without fear of guilt or reprisal was intoxicating. It was a slow process, learning to say no without apology. But with each small success, the weight of decades lifted slightly from my shoulders. I also returned to my passions, the quiet joys I had rediscovered after retiring. Painting, gardening, volunteering at the library. Each activity, once a simple pleasure, now carried the added satisfaction of being fully mine, untainted by obligation or expectation. I took long walks in the late afternoon sun, breathing in the air of my own independence, feeling it seep into my bones. For the first time in years, my life felt fully my own. Even my daughter's growth became a source of subtle pride. She struggled, stumbled, and learned. I offered guidance, but I no longer carried the burden of her choices. She was beginning to understand that privilege without effort was fleeting, that responsibility shaped character. Watching her take those first steps toward accountability gave me a quiet, steady comfort that I had not known before. Sitting in the quiet of my living room one evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the confrontation, the fallout. It had all been painful, unavoidable, yet necessary. I had reclaimed not only my finances and my autonomy, but also my peace. I could move forward without fear of manipulation, without the constant pressure to sacrifice my own well-being for others. Independence was no longer a distant goal. It was my reality, steady and resilient, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel whole.